Massey College, and I am here to welcome you to this ongoing series of webinars that Massey College is initiating around Arctic problems and opportunities. And I want to begin by not only thanking the head of Massey College for supporting this Arctic initiative, but also the Bill Graham Center of Contemporary History, who is our partner throughout the series. And to give thanks too to Tony Penikett, the former Premier of Yukon, who has been working with us at Massey to not only organize this particular session on permafrost, but to help us organize the Arctic Dialogue series in general. We know that the Arctic regions of the planet are warming at 3 times the rest of the planet. And this has led to an enormous series of challenges, not least about permafrost melting, both releasing additional gases, methane, into the air, but also the very infrastructure, the built infrastructure of the Arctic is collapsing because the permafrost is collapsing. So this is one of the most important long-term environmental but also social challenges for the people who live in our Arctic regions. So I'm delighted that you could join with us to learn more about permafrost, climate change, and what we can do about it.
Hello, my name is Tony Penikett. I am the panel moderator for today's discussion. Our topic is Arctic tundra permafrost thaw, risk and response. The discussion concerns a big problem, which most of the mass media have given little attention to so far. And most Arctic governments, we would say, have given way too little attention. I'm going to very briefly introduce our panel. Detailed biographies can be found at the website. So first of all, University of Alaska, Anchorage-based Professor Daly Sambo-Dodo is the International Chair of the Inuit Circumpolar Council. Jocelyn Jo Strack is a member of the Champagne and Ajax First Nation of the Yukon. A microbiologist, hydrologist, planner, and storyteller, she facilitates open and innovative explorations of relationships between land and people. Franklin Griffiths, Emeritus Professor of International Politics at the University of Toronto, is an internationally recognized expert on Arctic and Russian affairs. And Christopher Byrne, Chancellor's Professor of Geography at Carleton University and President of the International Permafrost Association. There will be 2 rounds of discussion with the panel, first on science and on facts on the ground. And the second round will be a discussion on policy responses by our 4 panelists. Questions from viewers, from students, online participants will follow, plus some comments from experts and from one federal minister. One reason officials, bureaucrats, use for inaction on this problem is uncertainty about the science of permafrost thaws. So to tell us what we know for sure, Chris Byrne will start off and Jocelyn Jo Strack will follow with some explanation of how people in the North relate to some of these events. Chris? You're on.
Thank you very much, Tony. I hope that everybody can see the slides that are on the screen here. I will begin these remarks by pointing out that the concern and interest that stimulated this meeting is a product not just of climate change, but because the rate and magnitude of the climate warming is higher in the Arctic than we anticipated only a few years ago. There are elements of the Earth atmosphere system that magnify climate change in the polar regions, and these affect the biochemical stability of the landscape. We do not think of landscapes such as you see here as emitters of greenhouse gases because we can see little industrial activity, but we are likely wrong. let me give you a sense of the magnitude of the issue. The next slide shows the 85-year record of mean annual temperature at Inuvik, near our Western Arctic coast. Up until 1970, the climate at Inuvik was relatively stable, but with an annual temperature of about 9.5 degrees Celsius. Since then, it has risen steadily. The line is the running mean of the previous 10 years, indicating a total change of about 3.5 degrees in the last 50 years. Most of the adjustment has been in the fall and in the winter, and an important consequence is the extension of the thawing season into the autumn. On the next slide, I will show the same running mean line, but I've added similar data from Ottawa. The scale for the Ottawa data is on the right, and for the Inuvik data on the left. You will notice that the climate change we are familiar with down here in the south is more gradual. In fact, if we determine the average rates of change, as on the next slide, you see that the Arctic rate is 3 times the magnitude of what we have experienced in the last 50 years. This Arctic amplification has led to consequences such as the reduction in late summer sea ice cover and the collapse of the Canadian Arctic ice shelves that have been reported recently. The next slide shows the consequences for permafrost of the warming that we have observed just north of Inuvik. Here we have a series of plots of ground temperature observed over the last 15 years. You will see the near surface temperatures in plot A rising steadily, and in plot C, you can see that the increases have been measured down to a depth of 50 meters below the surface. This shows the response of the permafrost system. The most important consequence of these data for today's discussion is that warmer permafrost draws less energy in summer deep into the ground, releasing some of the additional summer heat for thawing near the surface. Now, the next slide is an excavation of the seasonally thawed layer at the ground surface. This picture was taken in the Western Arctic. You will see the brown soil and the surface vegetation. You will also see that the dark brown soil is continuous with the black material at depth. Commonly in permafrost terrain, freezing and thawing of the surface leads to soil movement and circulation, drawing organic matter over hundreds of years down into the ground to form the top of permafrost. This is a principal permafrost carbon stock, and on the next image you will see a thick layer of it forming the very near surface of permafrost. This black horizon, just below the seasonally thawed layer, which is also dark with organic soil, is one of the most prevalent features visible in permafrost that is formed in sediments. Where sediments are actively being deposited, in deltas, for example, organic matter from roots and other material have become buried, as we will see now. This photograph is from an area where sediments have been deposited, and as the ground surface has risen, so has the top of permafrost. The rootlets are the most visible form of organic material now trapped in permafrost at this location. The upper layer of soil above the top of permafrost is where the roots of plants are growing at the moment. These give you a glimpse of some of the reasons for so much organic material to be trapped in permafrost. The map on the next slide gives us a summary of the permafrost soil carbon distribution in the Northern Hemisphere. You will see the widespread distribution of permafrost carbon in Canada and Russia, with the deepest red areas being places with the highest amounts of carbon. We have 2 particular areas of interest: the peatlands of Hudson Bay lowlands and the Mackenzie Valley. The total permafrost carbon stock is about 1,500 billion tons. And in the next slide here, we've broken that down. We think that there are about 1,000 billion tons, or what we call 1,000 petagrams, in the uppermost 3 meters of permafrost ground. Another 500 petagrams are in deeper sediments, both deltaic and ice age sediments. The quantity in the near surface, this 1,000 petagrams, compares with the total atmospheric carbon content, but it far outweighs the annual human emissions. This is the stock, the total amount in the permafrost. The key question is whether the carbon is being released. And the next slide takes us back to the site I showed you last. Here we can see that on this, the picture here shows that the plants at the surface are storing carbon, but within the surface layer that thaws every summer, microbes break the carbon down and release it back to the atmosphere. The Arctic has a carbon budget, weighing the relative storage of carbon and release. For a long time, we believed the Arctic was a net store for carbon, but now we believe the area is a source, especially because microbial activity continues long into the autumn and winter due to the lengthening summer, longer freezeback, and warmer winter conditions. This may be a key switch for our atmospheric system. The final slide is an overview of the Old Crow Flats in northern Yukon. It is salutary to think that each of these polygons may become a small net emitter of carbon, so that as far as the atmosphere is concerned, we have industrialized the tundra. Thank you.
Jocelyn, can we hear from you now?
Do you want to go first, Tony? I'm not sure we heard from you.
Sorry, I'm Jocelyn. Can you go next?
I can. Thank you, Tony. So, ING Takalama Uye. My name is Jocelyn Jostrack. I'm a member of the Champagne and Ajax First Nation of Whitehorse, Yukon. And I really enjoy working with Tony. I've had quite a few interactions with him working on different files, particularly in regards to our agreements in the Yukon. So thank you, Tony, for inviting me here. I am a scientist as a microbiologist and a hydrologist, but I've since really made a jump into areas of thinking about my culture, thinking about the world in a more whole way, thinking about values and responsibility. And in the question of permafrost, it's not necessarily science and technical sort of knowledge that I wish to share with you, but more one of values and lessons. Permafrost is like a security, a former cement, something that we stood upon that was expected to be still. But now as it is suddenly changing, shifting, altering, we find ourselves in a moment of perceived panic, of uncertainty, as the ground moves underneath our feet. And it makes you recognize this sort of false dependency that we hold in the systems that we have created. And I do like to think about permafrost as cement. So we have cemented our world, and we have expected a stability in that cement, in our buildings, in our grounds, our foundations. We've created foundation. But something that we don't always think about is the fact that the cement can be permeable, it can crack, it can erode, it can be greatly affected by the power of earth and the will of earth. In the old days, the people never expected such certainty from earth. There was always an ability to move, to be dynamic, to be strong, and to have knowledge and the capability to evolve and adjust, adapt through any sort of rapid change. such as a wildfire, such as an area that was once still now becoming a swamp. In many of our trails, they were up high on the ground instead of down low in the lowlands where it could be wet, where permafrost could shift from over the year. And so we would walk high when it was right, or we would walk low, because sometimes that was the easier trail in the winter. I feel the lessons that permafrosts are offering us is about our sense of security on this earth, and our sense of security in the systems that we have created, such as our financial systems, such as our infrastructure. But yet we need to recognize and accept that it can all be taken away. It is created by our human intellect, but not honored with our human spirit and emotion. And so as we approach the question of permafrost, of relationships, of working together, we need to come to a place of respect and honor for the role that permafrost plays in our security and the fact that it can be taken away in our folly, which is what is happening. A hard question, a hard thing to confront, a loss of security. When one loses their parents, nothing can shift your sense of personal security in a more stronger way. But it seems now we are losing Mother Earth. And it's frightening. It's very scary. In coming to an acknowledgement of shifting security, we must confront the hardships, the inner depths of who we are as a people and what we value and what it is we are willing to do for the children to come. Looking at this very scary, very large and uncertain question, we must dig deep for answers. And they do believe that they rely in places like values, responsibility, obligation to that which is bigger than what we have perceived as important in our minds. It's our hearts. It's our children. And the children of Mother Earth, all our relations. So I know that I am expected to give science, but in my role as a scientist in recovery, I wish to round out the conversation and give emotion, give spirit, give song. Unmute yourself, Tony.
Okay. Jocelyn, thank you very much. We're now going to hear from Franklin and Dali if they have some observations to add to what Chris and Jocelyn have said. Franklin?
Are you hearing me?
I am now.
Okay, sorry about that. I don't know if it was my fault, but there it is, we're talking.
Probably mine, Franklin.
Who knows? Anyway, thank you for what we've just heard. I can only add a little bit, but I would like to add. I'd like to say a number of things, maybe about values, indeed. But I'd start by saying that as I see it as a Southerner, because I'm really somebody from down south in Canada, the deep south even here in Toronto. I want to say that from my point of view, permafrost thawing began in England in around 1750. That's where it all starts. It starts with the technological innovation, that is the perfection of the steam engine and the creation of a tremendous appetite for coal. This is where it begins, and it begins and flourishes. It goes beyond England to right across Europe and over into North America. And technological innovation proceeds. Other kinds of fossil fuel are brought into play, including most recently fracking brings a technology and a new set of troubles that we have. The net effect of it is to create a lot of global warming and climate change. We could go into that more, but also this is where we recently come aware down south of permafrost thawing. This whole thing is, it seems to be, posing a very serious problem for us all down south. And it is a problem that arises indeed from the south, a northern experience that comes from the south. And I think it's brought upon the north and indeed upon the world by men from the south, mainly, not women, but men who are possessive individualists. They have an attitude to the world and to who they should be and what they might do. It is possessive and it seeks to control and to make use of and exploit the environment. It is also very individualistic and is not inclined to cooperation such as we need and such as I think is known and understood in the North as being essential to survival and indeed merely just to living a decent life. What I'm saying is that in its origins, permafrost thawing is human and it is southern. And that's the point I would like to start with and say that it is technological in its inspiration. Secondly, I would go on to say that today we have a carry-on of the technological thrust in the development of responses to climate change, global warming, but also perhaps permafrost thawing. These technical responses are taking shape here in Canada as well as other parts of the Northern Hemisphere. There are two broad responses. One of them I will call drawdown. The other I will call dim sun. That's not a Chinese meal, but a way of talking about the reduction of solar radiation that reaches the earth from the sun. The dimming of the sun is one of the things that's being considered. On drawdown, people are talking about planting countless amounts of trees to bring carbon out of the atmosphere and to bring it into the soil. There is talk of ocean cloud making and the creation of a cloud that will deflect some of the solar radiation and make the earth less hot. There are even ideas about putting sunscreens midway in the space between the earth and the sun, where the gravity of both cancels one another, and you can float tremendous screens, hypothetically, that would shield a lot of, or quite a lot of solar radiation from the earth and cool us down and offset the warming and indeed reduce, finally, it might be said, permafrost thawing. These things are quite substantial, and I could go into them further, but really what we're talking about is a series of responses that are technical. I think some of them have to be taken seriously because we are in serious trouble, and we may need actually to resort to solar radiation management, to putting particles of sulfur in the atmosphere to backscatter some of the solar radiation back into space and cool the planet as a result. These things I think are horrific, but they may be forced upon us, and we should be prepared to consider them now, in my view. The overall impression that is being created, though, is that we're dealing with a global problem and that we should try, if we can, to prevent permafrost change as well as climate change and global warming. I don't know if that's actually the prime response from Northerners. Maybe in the North there's a need to deal with permafrost melt and permafrost thawing. That is, and I think I got a little bit of suggestion from that from Jocelyn. It's not enough just to talk about prevention and high technologies. Indeed, it is necessary to do something and to look into ourselves and perhaps to adapt. It's not clear to me that this is where the northern thinking is going, but it'd be interesting to hear more about that. So on balance, my thought is that we need to reduce our emissions everywhere, north and south alike. We should identify and deploy the best technologies if we need them. But really, we need an alternative understanding of our problem, an understanding not of technology, but of humanity. Why it is our possessive individualist Southern culture has brought about such devastation. And it's not merely in the North, of course, but we're talking about the North. We need to get beyond possessive individualism into another way of thinking and acting. And I think to do that, there has to be North-South dialogue, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Franklin. Next up is Dali. Are you there?
Yes, yes, I am.
You have the floor, as we say.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Chris Byrne and also Jocelyn. I'll just make a couple of very brief comments. I think that in regard to the actual science and, in my view, the evidence that this is a concern and ought to be a growing concern among all people, not merely scientists and their continuing research in the area of the thawing of permafrost, but what you've underscored is the significance of the dramatic changes. The numbers that you've revealed in your brief presentation and indicating a 3 times much more intensive change in the Arctic, which has been underscored by other scientists and others, from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to a host of other researchers in terms of climate change overall and its impacts in the Arctic. But the numbers that you've revealed just in terms of permafrost are really underscored by your final statement that we have industrialized the tundra. And that is scary, as Jocelyn has said. This is a dramatic contribution that has been overlooked by many, and especially government and policymakers. So I think that from the presentation that you've given, it really does highlight the urgency of the conditions that we're facing. And as you say, you presented a photo of a landscape without the visible appearance of what's at risk and the contributions that are being made because of the dramatic changes with permafrost. So I think that for me, your presentation really does highlight the urgency of the conditions. And I'd like to thank Jocelyn for her important message about the human face to all of these issues, and really at the core, the values in terms of looking at the impacts of the dramatic changes that are occurring. I think that this element of understanding, especially around values, which Franklin has just spoken of as well, the values of the South in terms of the individualistic approach in contrast to what Inuit and other Indigenous peoples have brought to some of these matters. And that is thinking about the Arctic region, thinking about the environment generally, wherever it happens to be, in a collective fashion and in a holistic fashion, understanding that everything is interconnected, interrelated, and indivisible in terms of the environment, this holistic understanding, a holistic perspective, wherein individuals, human beings, are a part of that, of the environment, their environment. And for Inuit and other Indigenous peoples, this profound relationship, this spiritual relationship, this understanding that we too are a part of this environment, a species among other species, really needs to drive greater understanding about the impacts of climate change, the impacts of permafrost thaw, and also its contribution to this larger global issue that we're all facing. When I was listening to Jocelyn, the forefront of my mind came the quote from Oren Lyons, a Haudenosaunee faith keeper, in response to a question within the World Economic Forum. They were asking, what do we do? What do we do? Oren Lyons very profoundly stated, we need value change for survival. And I think that what Jocelyn has shared really does point up this very significant understanding of the world community's approach. Again, value change for survival. But it also means taking everything into account in terms of the impacts that we're seeing specific to permafrost, but also all the other contributing factors to the global climate change crisis that we are facing. So I'll yield there and just thank both Chris and Jocelyn for their presentations and their important messages. Rihanna.
Thank you, Dali. I don't know if I'm on or not. Am I? Okay, so we're now going to move from those 4 excellent presentations about the science of permafrost thaw and facts on the ground and values, as the last 2 speakers mentioned, to this next question, which is, how should policymakers in Ottawa and Washington respond to this challenge? And also, what role should the regional governments in Alaska, the Yukon, Northwest Territories, Nunavut, and their European and Russian counterparts play in addressing this issue? So in this round of comments, we're going to go first to Franklin Griffiths, and then to Dali Sambodoro, and then for Chris and Jocelyn to add any thoughts they may have on the policy question.
Thank you very much,
Yeah.
Tony. Thank you. These are very, very big questions that we've broached here, and I'm hesitant to even try to climb this high hill that we've got in front of us. A great high pingo, you might say, that is there, that I've got to get up on. But my question, I guess, will be maybe a little more general than you've phrased it, Tony. I will ask really what now is to be done, quite and maybe quite narrowly, about permafrost thawing. And I will suggest a number of things just for discussion and to get us going, perhaps to get our viewers going as well. I'm going to suggest, in fact, let me start by saying that we should, and who is the we? It's those who are interested and able to get things moving. We should set up a Permafrost Canada panel, a group of people from Canadians who will seek to get action going in Canada on the permafrost thawing issue. This should be a panel that includes, right from the very get-go, Indigenous northern leaders, Southern politicians, people with connections to foundations and financial institutions, opinion makers, and people who are able to work the media down south, and all kinds of others. I could go on, but it should be a high-power panel if we could put it together. It would aim, I think, to do a couple of things. Number one, it should attack the whole question of permafrost thaw prevention, how to prevent it or slow it down radically. I think as well, though, it should look at adaptation to permafrost thawing. And I say third, a high power panel that I'm proposing should also be engaged in the promotion of collective action, which could be another way of talking about national unity in Canada, collective action. In this case, it would be north-south as well as east-west. We would get north-south discussion going and knit ourselves together as a country rather better in dealing with a serious crisis. On the matter of prevention to begin with, I believe that we have to find a way in Canada to engage Russia. There's no way when 2/3 of the world's permafrost is in Russia that we in Canada can hope to deal with this effectively on our own and capture the attention and the support of many other people in doing a very difficult and costly job if 2/3 of the job is not being addressed over on the Russian side. The Russians have to be engaged if we are to deal with preventive action against permafrost thawing. It's very hard to engage Russia, but we must give it a try, I believe, or else we are forced back emphatically to adaptation. And I don't think we should yield that ground. Engaging Russia is no easy matter, as I say. It would be necessary, first of all, for a permafrost panel to gather the support of the government of Canada and the good offices and approval of Canada and the Canadian government before we try to approach the Russians. And I think this should be possible. I hope it is to obtain. And we would seek over on the Russian side to set up, if we can, get the Russians indeed to set up a counterpart panel of their own. So there'll be two panels at work on permafrost. And we would start together then, the Canadian and Russian panels, to create a international permafrost working group to bring together the best minds, again, Indigenous and Northern as well as Southern, to address permafrost and what to do about it. We would furthermore, if we're moving this panel into high gear, be encouraging the government of Canada to approach the Russians in the context of the Arctic Council. The Russian government is, in fact, in May of next year, going to take over the Arctic Council for a 2-year period as the chair. This gives them a lot of initiative and power and scope to set the Arctic Council's agenda, and we may be able together to influence Russians on this side. It's important, I think, though, that Canada not approach the Arctic Council directly with an appeal to consider permafrost issues. Rather, we should deal directly with the Russians first, because they are sure to consider permafrost as their issue. And why should the Arctic Council in Canada want, as it were, to horn in? We should prepare the way in a discussion with the Russians, it would seem to me. And there are various things more I could say, but right away I must admit there are problems. And we've got to acknowledge problems in dealing with Russia. Number one, in Russia, there is no clear agreement on just what the problem is with climate change, how serious, how grave, and where its origins are. On the whole, there seems to be a belief that climate change is cyclical and that human activity is not greatly important in the cause of it. It's a little like Trump. I think Putin has said similar things, but has not been as open as Trump. But on the whole, he's inclined to doubt the human causes of climate change and so on. Nevertheless, I should add, from what I hear, in Russia, there is an acute, a serious awareness of permafrost and what it is doing and what it threatens the whole of Russia with. And that is something that one may be able to work with. There are other things I could say, but let me add that in addition, there will be problems in dealing with Russia that arise on the Canadian end. The Russian government is in its own way suppressing the indigenous people of the Russian Arctic. It's making it hard for them to express themselves and to relate in a circumpolar fashion the way they would like to and should. And I could go into this, but I'll say simply that this is going to make it difficult for Canadian Indigenous people, maybe also Indigenous people in Alaska and elsewhere, to deal with Russians when Russians are not themselves dealing fairly and well with Indigenous people. And there is still another aspect, I guess, and that is, well, what is it? I've almost forgotten here. Let me pass. I'll say simply that we still have to strive to deal with Russia and do our best. And if it doesn't work, we need to have ready an adaptation strategy. And I say we, I'm meaning a would-be panel that is trying to deal with all of this. Adaptation, I think, is an area I would prefer to hear from from the Indigenous people of Canada. I don't know, and I'm really not qualified to speak. But I can say, I think that there is need for a discourse and a discussion between Northerners and Southerners in Canada. We're not talking really. In fact, we're probably talking past one another. There are Southerners who are really concerned about the global effects of climate change and the global potential for permafrost thawing to feed back into more global warming, more heat, and more climate disaster. This is one discussion that is going on in the North, but really we need to talk as well, as I say, about adaptation, and we find a way for Southerners to realize just what it is that Northerners think and want. We need, as Southerners, I will speak for Southerners and say, we need actually to understand permafrost thawing and climate change from within. We see it from the outside rather more. We don't live with it the way Northerners do. I think there's something we have to learn from the Northerners, maybe quite a lot, about what it is we together face commonly. We need also to, I think, focus more on our milieu and thinking about our environment rather more than about our possessions. For instance, Arctic sovereignty and the resources we want to extract from the Arctic. We need to take care of and indeed cherish our milieu in a way that I think Northerners can tell us things that we really need to know. We need, in other words, a new discourse. And I think this is something that an active group of Canadians could encourage, the development of a discourse. Last of all, I want to say that recently I observed a permafrost webinar that was really quite a good one, but the best words I heard there came from a young Indigenous woman who lives in a village on the shores of the Yukon River in Alaska. She said, and I wrote down roughly what I think she said as she said it. She said, "We are in need of respect, listening and relationship building among people, including Western scientists and policymakers with very different views, all of us, with very different views and ways of knowing and sharing." That to me sums up what we need to really be talking about, different ways of sharing. I couldn't agree more with that person from the banks of the Yukon. And that having been said, I want to say thank you.
Thank you again, Franklin. And now we'll go to Dali and for your perspective as the chair of the Inuit Circumpolar Council.
Okay. First of all, I would like to say that when Tony contacted me about this, what do I know about permafrost? And I don't have the background that individuals like Jocelyn and Chris have. And okay. But policy, possibly I can make a contribution in that regard. But before we get into that, I wanted to go back to a comment that you made, Tony, at the very outset of this gathering about policymakers or those in government utilizing the excuse that, well, we don't have certainty about the science. And this is often an excuse. We see it certainly in the context of Indigenous peoples and impacts of all sorts, not just related to the dire impacts of climate change. But I was taken by a study that was concluded in 2015, and I just wanted to make note of the study and some of the information found in the study about permafrost. And it focused upon the ice cellars in the community of Utqiagvik in Barrow, Alaska. That ice cellars are a natural form of refrigeration constructed within permafrost. They're traditionally employed by Indigenous Arctic peoples to store harvested wildlife. And recent reports from Alaska indicate that ice cellars are failing through mechanisms that include flooding and collapse, which are often attributed to climate change. And in the abstract of the study, they indicated that a total of 71 cellars were cataloged and mapped over a 10-year period. The large number of cataloged cellars show the importance and great potential loss for the community of Barrow if widespread failures were to occur. And that doesn't sound like very much if you think about the community of Utqiagvik. But if one considers the importance of these ice cellars and the diverse elements of the ice cellars, the role that they play physically within the community in terms of the storage of food, in terms of the, again, very sacred elements of ensuring that those ice cellars are clean, pristine, and ready to receive the gift of the whale. This is huge. And though it may be only one community, it also represents what is happening in all of the communities that utilize ice cellars as a key to their food security, to their cultural beliefs and values, their relationship with the whale. All of this is impacted. So, you know, if you look at the evidence of this particular study, one has to keep in mind all of these interrelated elements. And I think that the comments that I made earlier are significant to this overall discussion. And it sounds as though there's a real consensus in the remarks of Franklin and Jocelyn, as well as Chris, that we need a change in perspective. And if we think about it in terms of everything in the environment, whole ecosystems, and how interconnected and interrelated they have, that they have to be, their integrity as revealed by just the impacts of the permafrost and ice cellars, that it illustrates how everything is impacted. And this leads me to the issue of some of the papers that were circulated in preparation for this gathering, which argued that science and engineering need to drive policy. Well, I would argue, and as has been said by both Jocelyn and Franklin, is that Indigenous knowledge, science, and engineering must drive policy. too often the accumulated knowledge, the intricate knowledge of Arctic Indigenous peoples, and I'm speaking specifically of Inuit, and accumulated over centuries, that this is often missing from any discussion about policy, and especially about climate change policy. And if we talk about adaptation, some of the first sources should be Inuit knowledge holders. And we ourselves are the evidence of the kind of adaptation that is needed. Often commentators point to the resilience of Arctic Indigenous peoples, the resilience of Inuit. Well, it's based upon adaptation to the changes. So my main point is that those who are talking about science and engineering driving policy, that it's absolutely imperative that Indigenous knowledge, science, engineering are the drivers of policy. And this leads me to the important element of the role and the status and the rights of Indigenous peoples. The role, the status, and the rights of Inuit. If you think about the Arctic region, and I saw the beautiful maps illustrated in the recent Reuters article about permafrost that were shared amongst the panel members and others working on this particular issue, that a majority of the permafrost that's being impacted are in Canada and the Russian Federation. Well, I think it's important to remind the world community and those listening that if you look at the traditional territory of Inuit, we're talking about over 40% of the Arctic circumpolar region. So in terms of not only the accumulated knowledge, but also our own rights and our responsibility to future generations, which Jocelyn referenced earlier, are highly significant in any policy decision. In terms of our status, role, and rights, I think that it is imperative to understand that not only is it a need for the moral imperative, but also the legal imperative of ensuring that Inuit and other Arctic Indigenous peoples have a seat at the table. In terms of especially if we look at simply the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act and land title, or the comprehensive land claims agreements in Canada, the issues that are arising in Greenland and their potential path towards independence, the majority of the Inuit in Greenland, if we look at the reliance upon the land of our Siberian Yupik relations in Chukotka, they not only have rights to those lands, territories, and resources, but they also have responsibilities for future generations to maintain the integrity of that land. And for this reason, the human rights of Indigenous peoples, the human rights of Arctic Indigenous peoples have to be taken into consideration in terms of policy, and also just the perspectives, the worldviews and perspectives. Of course, related to the legal and moral imperatives are the recognition, especially in the context of Arctic Indigenous peoples and the Arctic 8 states. I mean, with the exception of Iceland, where there are no Indigenous peoples, every one of the other Arctic states has a long history of recognition, not necessarily respect, but recognition of the status, rights, and role of Indigenous peoples. National policy, national laws, an extraordinary wealth of jurisprudence that affirms that Indigenous peoples are different. They have the right to be different and respected as such. But this is also quarterbacked by not only the international human rights instruments that have affirmed the rights of Arctic Indigenous peoples, that have affirmed the rights of Inuit, namely the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, but also too often governments in the face of policy and policy development have forgotten their fiduciary obligations. And these are solemn and serious obligations. Canada wouldn't exist without the recognition of this legal doctrine. I mean, think about it just in terms of geography. The United States wouldn't exist if it weren't on the basis of this horrific history of subjugation, domination, and exploitation of land. So these fiduciary obligations are crucial to understanding that Indigenous peoples have a role to play in any kind of policy development. And I think it's something that is too often overlooked or forgotten. Many in the South think, what are we doing giving handouts to the natives? And they forget that the source of the lands, the states that have grown up across the globe and not just in the Arctic are on the backs of the Indigenous peoples that are present, still vital, and remain vital to all of these different questions. I think that we also should recognize, and especially policymakers, the extraordinary adaptation costs. If we're talking about the failing of 71 ice cellars in one community alone, never mind all of the collectivities of Inuit and others in the Arctic region, we're talking about extraordinary adaptation costs. And so this has to be factored into any response, any substantive policy response to these issues. I just want to also comment on what Franklin has highlighted in terms of the Russian Federation and Canada. I think that is absolutely true that there needs to be a national and domestic response by these governments, indeed by all Arctic nation states, and that Indigenous peoples need to be a significant element of the policy response. But I also want to highlight that this is a global problem and it requires global solutions. And much of it goes to the heart of what Jocelyn said earlier about values and the change of values. But I also argue this point because we have to recognize the geopolitical landscape that the Arctic has now been thrust into at the international level. That the energy security of China rests within our homelands and those of Arctic Indigenous peoples across the Russian Federation and elsewhere. Their food security is tied to the Arctic. Their economic security and the potential because of climate change is tied to the Arctic. So we have to constantly be mindful of these global geopolitical issues in terms of policy specific to curbing and ending the failure of permafrost. I think that the other dynamic, of course, in support of what Franklin has said about the Russian Federation and Canada, is that all scales have to be addressed. The international, at the international level, at the regional level, in terms of the Arctic Council, in terms of the Arctic 8 states, at the national and domestic level, as well as at the local level, and that actors and the important role of rights holders such as Indigenous peoples need to be involved at at every single scale. So we do need global solutions to this global problem, but also begin to spur such change and development starting from the ground level, starting from the local level. So I'll just conclude by reiterating that we do need value change for survival, but that more significantly in this area of permafrost failure and the impacts of climate change, that concrete action and concrete, coordinated, and coherent policy can, in fact, be developed if people take a breath, take a moment, and consider all of the things that are impacted by this very specific but important issue. And the final thing that I want to say is that not only do the Arctic 8 states, but the entire world community, what is needed is the responsiveness to Indigenous peoples. And I suppose one hopeful element is what's taking place within the UNFCCC, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the fact that Indigenous peoples have managed to gain a specific space in terms of these global dialogues about climate change, and that researchers are beginning to look at the issues of permafrost, and that Western science is now outreaching to Indigenous peoples and Indigenous knowledge holders. Not enough is being done in this regard, but I think that the opportunities are there, and I'm actually optimistic about the kind of policy change that we can actually see in terms of all of the different scales, all of the different levels in which we need to begin addressing the matters. I don't have any immediate commentary to Franklin's proposal, but hope that some of the elements that I've raised in my remarks will be taken into consideration, and indeed have already been referenced in the context of Franklin's proposal. So thank you very much.
Dolly, thank you. And I'm now going to go to Chris, putting on his policy hat as president of the International Permafrost Association, to add some thoughts on what the two previous speakers have had to say.
So I have two sets of thoughts. One is philosophical and the other set is practical or pragmatic. The philosophical point is that I think we are commonly in danger of overestimating what science can give us. For example, if I pose the question, why is that kettle boiling? I can give you a scientific answer about heat coming to the bottom of the kettle and raising the saturation vapor pressure of the water to the level of the atmospheric pressure. I can also say that the kettle is boiling because I want some tea. Now, the fact that I wanted tea is not a scientific answer to the question, but the previous one is a scientific answer to the question. What science does not deliver us are the answers to the life questions. And the life questions are, how should I lead a good life? What does it mean to be a good person? What does it mean to make a value judgment that some things are preferable to do than others? Science does not lead us to those answers. It might support some of those answers, but it doesn't lead us to those answers. And so I think we must recognize that when we develop policy, policy is about the world we want there to be. It's not about the world that is. If the world that is good enough, we won't have a policy to change it. But policy is about changing things so that they achieve what we want. And we can, one of the things that we want is, of course, is sustainability. So it seems to me that science can support policy, but policy must be driven by our understanding of where we want to be in 30 years' time, or where we want to be in 25 years' time, or 50 years' time. And science has given us a lot of capacity. It's given us a lot of technique, and it's given us a lot of understanding. But it doesn't help us to make those kinds of decisions. Now, the pragmatic area, the response I would have is that fundamentally, with the climate change problem and with the permafrost issues, we have really three different things that we can do. One is mitigate. That is, we can make sure there's less carbon in the atmosphere than there would be if we did nothing. The second is we can adapt. And that means we may be able to anticipate some of the consequences of increases in carbon concentration in the atmosphere and prepare ourselves to be able to manage those. And the third, which is more difficult, is to decide how we're going to become resilient. And resilience is basically developing the capacity to be able to deal with unanticipated consequences. Not the anticipated ones. The anticipated ones we can adapt to because we know that they may be coming. Resilience is a much more difficult thing to deal with. But resilience is tied up very much with the ideas of how do we want to look after each other? And I think this is where I've been most affected by what Dali has been saying to us. Because one of the differences that I understand between traditional ways of knowing and Western scientific ways of knowing is that whereas there may be a lot of local knowledge about what is or what has been in the Western scientists' understanding of the world and in traditional knowledge holders' understanding of the world, in addition, within traditional knowledge, there is also an idea of how the world should be. What are the relations that should govern our interaction between each other? And that is something which I think is at the heart of policy making. And so, therefore, I would just endorse what Dali has said about listening to people who have an idea of in that realm. And I would also endorse very much Franklin's idea, or what he's articulated at least, and that is that unless there is more dialogue, there will never, ever be any progress. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, very much. So Jocelyn, I would be surprised if you didn't have something to add to this conversation. Jocelyn?
Thank you, Tony. Am I on?
You are.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone, for your thoughtful and considerate words, and especially in moving the conversation, I guess, to a place where I feel very humbled to have the last kind of round of input. A couple of weeks ago, I was in our fishing village of Cluckshoe. Very beautiful place. And it's where we fish salmon. And I'd been working a moose hide with my family. And I'm a learner. And there's a lot to know to work a moose hide. The ladies, they used to take them weeks. They would hunt an animal and they would just set up camp right there and then work the moose hide from beginning to end until they could turn it into clothes and then walk away. Maybe 3 weeks. But I'd been working the moose hide and we cleared out where the grandmas used to work the moose hide for the first time. And I was looking around for something and I come around this old shed and here I heard a noise. I was like, what is that? And finally I see a little head poke out from underneath the shed, and it was an ermine. And it was super interested in me. And it kept playing, running back and forth between these two little holes. And so I stood there for a little bit and I was talking to it. And then all of a sudden a magpie come and sit up here. And he started talking. He started squawking at me and he looked at me and just sort of like, what's that? I was like, oh, it's an ermine. How are you guys doing? That's never happened to me before. Talking to the animals like that. They talk to me now because I take time to listen. I go outside my door every morning and I say, Guinness Chish, thank you for a new day. I've started to know when I'm being directed. And I believe the reason why this is starting to happen is because I have started telling the stories. I've started slowing down, and I've started taking the time to work hard, to do art, to sing, and to do what I need to do to live in a good way. We do not have time in this life to know how to speak to the animals. And if we cannot speak to them, we cannot know what to do. To me, one of the greatest policy challenges that we could make would be to reduce 9-to-5 working. I believe that if we had flexible work hours, that if we lived seasonably, and that if we respected the cycles of Earth and then amended our lives to flow with Earth, we would reduce pressure. And with this time that we are allotted by not sitting in front of the computer, using our minds and talking all the time, we would be doing. So everybody deserves the skills and the knowledge to be able to support their own life as a family unit, as an individual. We should all know how to sow, grow, build, sing, dance, pray, know when the ancestors are standing behind you and telling you what to do. We have none of that right now. We have traded all of that capacity for money. And for this ability to talk with each other, which is important, sharing ideas, talking, searching is important, but doing is more important. And by doing, this includes completely transforming our education system, particularly, and giving time for us as adults to regain the skills that we were robbed of through the education system that taught us to sit. My grandpa did not sit. They were up with the sun, and they were busy throughout the day till they sat down and went to sleep. There was no chairs. They didn't have chairs. They sat on the ground and they worked. And you know, when they took my father, his siblings to school, they wanted them to go at first because they didn't want them to live that hard life. There's stories of starvation. It was not easy. And I respect that. I do not romanticize the hardship of a winter. But I believe that we are here offered an opportunity for a balance, a luxury. We didn't have a lot of art where I lived because they traveled. They had to always move around. So a lot of the art went into the clothing. They had to be able to carry what they took. And then I think about the coastal people who had lived in bounty and they stayed in one spot and they had beautiful art and beautiful buildings. It is a luxury, but it's one that we have and that we squander. So I think that in giving time, to me again, one of the biggest policy changes that the federal governments could make would be reducing 9-to-5 working and increasing the skills and capacity of people to be able to do for themselves and live with their families and raise their children. Then I think our values would change. And I think we would reduce pressure on Earth because we wouldn't be living surrounded by plastic. I had a dream the other night. I couldn't sleep just 2 nights ago. It must have been to be able to tell you this. It was about mothers. My name is White Mother, White Dakal, Mother Amma. And, you know, Mother Earth, we've just completely neglected her, and it's so sad, but she truly is a mother. She gives us all the teachings. That's what the moose hide taught me. How much knowledge is required to work a moose hide. It's incredible It's incredible. And my little science mind started going when I smoked it. I was like, it's chemistry. Chemistry. It changes the hide and it makes it so you can preserve it. I was like, look at all, they knew that. They knew all of that. But you know who taught them? Nobody taught them. Mother Earth taught them. Mother Earth, she is the ultimate teacher. And she's teaching us now. She says, get rid of your plastic. She says, live with me again. And she is a true teacher. And she's giving us all the lessons that we need. We have a saying in my people, we say, hard times are coming. Hard times are coming. And sometimes I wonder if the hard times have already come, but you know, the hard time it's like self-inflicted. And unless we listen, we take the time to listen, then, you know, we will forever spin. It's easy to spin with all of this knowledge. But when you express through different ways of knowing, through creativity, through peace, through doing, through art, doing a moose hide is very hard work. You have to go like this and like, oh, my muscles. My one cousin, he said his mother had arms that were huge because she worked so hard all the time. She was very healthy. It's just sad, really. All of the potential of a human. We don't allow it. We sit here. So I've gone bold in my suggestions, but this is what I believe in coming to know what I've come to know through being peaceful, for just searching for my best self so I can be a good mom to my girls. That's where this has come from. It truly is. And I'm so grateful to know when the ancestors stand behind me. I can feel when they come. It's a very wonderful gift, and I do not undermine it. And I've been trying to share that happens with more. And the more that I share the knowing of the ancestors, the more that I hear that it happens to many. And I feel less alone. So I believe that we should all be able to talk to the birds at least. But it requires a bit of peace, a bit of inner knowing. And with all of that, it requires time. So that's what I have to share. Goodness cheese.
We're now coming, after those 4 very eloquent statements, to the question period. And I'm going to ask anybody who sends an online question to address it to one of the panelists. I'm hoping that we will give an opportunity to the panelists to answer the question for others to join in if they wish. We're also inviting comments from experts who may be participating in this discussion or viewing this discussion. And if we don't have any questions immediately, we do have a couple of comments from people who were sent in by using a new technology, taping 1-minute interventions. And we have one from Lars Kullerud, who is the president of the University of the Arctic, which is a consortium of 200 universities. And we have another one from David Akiak, who's the Deputy Premier of Nunavut. But I have a question on the screen. I'm going to read it out. I don't think it's addressed to any one panelist, but I will try and direct it properly. And the answer is, the question is from Stephen Gruber. What motivated the framing of this panel around urgent action is needed in the north to avoid runaway emissions, when the emissions that drive permafrost thaw and additional emissions are predominantly occurring outside the north? This framing surprised me because the need for action in the north relates to adapting to the consequences of thaw. By contrast, preventing emissions needs climate action globally. That point has been made by several panelists. The recent IPCC special report on ocean and cryosphere in a changing climate provides a sound assessment of the issue, and then goes on to say Permafrost Net is a multi-sectoral Canadian response to the challenge. And it's a comment from Stephen Gruber. Is there any panelist who would like to particularly respond to that? Chris, perhaps? I'm not hearing you, Chris.
Yes, thank you, Tony. I think the point really is that, at least my understanding of this is that whereas in Canada for some years now, we have been concerned about the immediate consequences of climate change on permafrost stability. And there have been a number of initiatives that have been associated with, very tangible things like infrastructure and the integrity of roads or airfields or buildings. Those sorts of effects in this country have been quite widely discussed and have been supported by both territorial, provincial and federal government to provoke action and response to. The permafrost carbon issue has not received nearly as much traction in the from agencies and governments in Canada. In contrast with some of the activities that are promoted in the United States or in European countries. It is true, as Stefan points out, that global emissions are effectively driving the climate. And as a result of that, we are faced with the position that we are at the moment. Within Canada, however, we have ducked the permafrost carbon issue, which is remarkable given that we have half of our country within the permafrost regions. And so I think the purpose of this panel is to raise our national awareness of this as an issue, rather than, and in my remarks, I didn't mention anything to do with the stability of infrastructure. Jocelyn will be very familiar with the stability of infrastructure, not just in Champagne-Ajac traditional territory, but in other parts of the Yukon, as you will be too, Tony. So I think that's an area that we are well aware of at the moment. The permafrost carbon issue is one which many other jurisdictions are active on, and in which we as a country have not given the attention to which we might think it is deserving of, given the amount of permafrost carbon that we actually have in Canada.
We have a question from Professor David Estrin, who I might mention was a high school classmate of mine. And I'll read the question out, and we'll see who, maybe it might be a question for Dali or Frank, but anyway, it's a question comment for the panel regarding the role of human rights and the rights of a healthy environment to advance progress on addressing permafrost action. Could the needed further dialogue and attention as to what could or should be done re-permafrost action at the state level, Russia, US, Canada, as mentioned by several panelists, be advanced by considering the leverage that could be available under the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights to which these countries are parties? These states all pledge to protect the right to life, and this is now agreed to include the right to a healthy environment. Legally, each country has agreed to provide a right for its courts or human rights bodies to adjudicate claims by people within these countries who are concerned their rights are being affected by failure of governments to act appropriately. Is there a role for this to advance the dialogue, and should this be explored? So I'm going to go to you first, Dali, because you are the lawyer on the panel.
Well, I think that this is an important question, and in fact, human rights advocates have been agitating for quite a while about the right to a safe and healthy environment. The one thing that I would say about it is that, as I said in relation to Indigenous perspectives about the environment, actually the interrelated, interdependent, interconnected, and indivisible nature of human rights is one of the major characteristics about human rights. And in the advancement of anything to do with the right to a safe and healthy environment, must take into account the very specific cultural context of the peoples concerned, and in this case, Indigenous peoples. I think that it may be a useful argument to make. It may be a possible element of a very multi-pronged approach to attacking some of these issues, to advance the various different arguments through the treaty bodies and the UN regime of human rights, also potentially at the national and the domestic level. But at the same time, I think that some of the commentary that Jocelyn has provided, that it's important to think of how to really reorient policy and policy development so that you don't get to the point where in our two litigious societies, especially the United States, that you have to resort to such matters, that both, as I started out in my comments, the legal and the moral imperatives should be far more compelling than the need to take on such advocacy. But at the same time, as a human rights advocate, I've already conjured up a whole list of possible actions that Indigenous peoples have taken. In fact, I saw an email yesterday of an article, a study of all of the different cases that have been brought by peoples, including Indigenous peoples, in relation to national and domestic litigation, as well as international cases, such as the past case brought by Inuit and led by Sheila Watt-Cloutier within the Organization of American States system, about the causal linkage between climate change and the emissions being generated by the United States in industrial activity. So there is potential there, and the right to a safe and healthy environment. In fact, in my interpretation of, for example, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, it has actually been crystallized in the context of Indigenous human rights. But there are opportunities that could be explored. The other dynamic to this is that governments across the globe, including Arctic nation states, have acceded to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Even the government of the United States has acceded to this international covenant. And once you superimpose an Indigenous perspective to the international covenant and link these arguments, you do have a pretty powerful case that one could bring forward. But it would be my hope that governments adhere to the obligations that they have made, many of which are self-imposed, because we weren't authors and we weren't at the negotiating table when the international covenants emerged. It was governments, it was the UN member states themselves that did so. So I think that there are opportunities, there are possibilities, and I would encourage the exploration of them, not only by Indigenous peoples, but by all other peoples. One other final thing that I wanted to say, which I completely slipped up on in my remarks, is that in the context of Indigenous peoples, I think it's important for us to recognize that there are many compounding forces that are facing Inuit communities, and that if we now add this dimension of the permafrost thaw, the contributions of Canada, the Russian Federation, and others to the carbon being emitted, that this is just another compounding factor and it goes all the way back to the historical context of colonialism, to even the doctrines that I referred to as far as the fiduciary obligations of governments to take the best care of Indigenous peoples in a legal context. We weren't contributors to that dialogue in and of itself as well. But I just want to everyone to think about that this is just another layer. The potential for increased vessel traffic, the coastal erosion of communities, which contributes to food insecurity. All of these things, it's another layer. So, so we shouldn't in policy terms offer just a veneer to the responses that are needed. Thank you.
Thank you, Dali. We have a question from a gentleman associated with Massey College and the University of Toronto, which is Tom Axworthy. So I'm going to read it out, and then I'm going to ask Chris and perhaps Jocelyn to respond to this. The question is, Jocelyn used a very good image that previously the land was like concrete, giving a sense of security, but now the concrete is cracking. When the concrete cracks in the south, we re-pour it. But if permafrost is melting, what can be done? What examples of how best to protect infrastructure? So can I ask Chris, you go first on this, and then Jocelyn follow?
Yes, thank you, Tony. So there are, as it is at the moment, many structures have been designed for construction in the permafrost regions. And for about the last 20 years, the design engineers have been aware that that climate change is an issue, and they have had to try to develop mitigation measures. And these involve various different techniques. The most important new technology that is used regularly is what we call is the use of what we call thermosiphons, and these are passive cooling mechanisms which allow the cold winter conditions to extract heat more efficiently from the ground than would be done normally. And thereby we keep the ground under particular buildings relatively cool. These were invented for the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, and they're very familiar to people who are in Alaska. However, there are various other small modifications that can be made to help buildings adjust their foundations as the ground settles beneath them. One of the things that we are not as good at doing is determining where are the places that permafrost thaw is going to lead to vulnerabilities of the materials that we're building on, and whether we should in fact avoid some of these places. And the reason for this is that characteristically, site investigation is expensive and doesn't usually yield an immediate return. And therefore the incentive to do a lot of expensive work before a building is constructed is not something that a developer looks forward to. The result is that we have a number of cases in Canada where there have been very expensive mistakes that have occurred because constructions have taken place in the wrong location. This is one of the areas that I think we have to really pay a lot more attention to, is deciding where things should be erected and are the conditions that occur before that. But in the long run, the question of how much permafrost thaw is tolerable by a building or by a road is essentially one where where we are looking in the eyes at failure. And it is a difficult problem to say to somebody, it may well be that in 25 years' time, your proposed structure is going to be inadequate, and it may fail. It may not perform according to code and so forth. What that leads to is a very difficult decision as to whether a project should go forward or not. And those are the sorts of decisions that people who are looking now at the future, because an infrastructure investment is characteristically a 50-year investment, they're now looking at those decisions head on. But we do not have a mechanism in Canada that makes that sort of that sort of assessment something that we could all agree on. It's a very difficult thing to predict what the future climate is going to be, and therefore it's very difficult to predict what the behavior of infrastructure is going to be when we're looking at a 50-year timetable. Over 10 years, we have much greater security, but the timescales involved in this are longer than what most people have characteristically thought about for a changing environment.
Thank you, Chris. Jocelyn, I'm going to ask you if you could be brief, because we have 3 other questions waiting and I want to get to them before our time is up. Okay, Jocelyn?
Yes, very much so. No problem being brief. I don't think I have a concrete answer, but I have a story. So when they built the Alaska Highway in the Yukon, it was the American Army, and they built it during World War II to build a road to Alaska. But they came through the Yukon in a fury. It was a matter of months that they pushed the road through, and they had First Nations guides show them where the road should go. And we still sit around the table laughing because they said, you guys should go that way, because it was like the most swampy, mucky, most difficult way that they could possibly go. And now the road is still there. The road still goes through the most swampy, difficult way the road could go. And, so the question becomes, like what Chris alluded to, do we rebuild, disturb another area? Do we sit with what we have, which I think is what we're doing? Do we continually, arrogantly repave every year, same spots, every single year they do it? I don't know what the answer is, but I always do go back to values and then the stories. I like the model of yesterday, today, tomorrow. So yesterday, it was maybe the road never should have gone through. Wasn't built for a good reason, but now it helps us. Today we're very dependent on it. It is our one life route to the south, the Alaska Highway, and we are fortunate to have it. Tomorrow, are we still going to be wanting as dependent on the road? Perhaps if we increase our self-reliance and self-sufficiency within the Yukon, we'll be less dependent on what comes up, but we'll still want to go out. Maybe we'll have more time to travel a dirt road rather than a cement road. These are the choices and the balances we'll have to make as we adapt to the needs of Earth and the choices that we've made that have brought us here today.
Thank you, Jocelyn. So we're going to look now at a couple of videos that were sent in by people. They are short, and then I'm going to try and get in a couple more questions before we wrap up. But to all the panel respondents, I'm going to ask for short answers. Thank you. So, Emily, are we going to you for the videos?
University Arctic is the unique network created by the Arctic about collaboration between universities to serve the needs of the Arctic. Very often, northern universities are smaller universities and at least not the leading universities in their home countries. So the north is the periphery on each of the 8 Arctic countries. By uniting universities around the north, suddenly the periphery becomes the center. You take the northern institutions and work together across the Arctic, around the circumpolar north, and by that you build strength. The real cooperation actually happens when faculty and students meet, do things together, and learn from each other or research together. In UArctic, we do this through thematic networks and UArctic institutes. In those there is maybe 3, maybe 15, 20 institutions who work together around an issue. There are more than 50 of those in the Arctic. Any higher education institution in the world who have some interest in the Arctic should of course be part of this network.
So that was Lars Kallerud, who is the president of the University of the Arctic, a consortium of 200 universities. I don't know whether I'm on or not, but I can't tell on my screen. Am I? Okay. The next video will be from David Akiak, who's the Deputy Premier of Nunavut.
Unlukun. I'm David Akiak, the Deputy Premier for the Government of Nunavut. The climate is changing. As researchers in today's panel are telling us, permafrost is thawing across the north and in some areas more drastic than others. In Nunavut, the impact from permafrost thaw are affecting us in many aspects of our daily lives, from damage to buildings, roads and runways, to causing erosions to our coastlines and harming our traditional hunting routes. This year, one of our main focus is to renew the regular permafrost monitoring in the communities and across Nunavut. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Premier. I'm going to go ask a couple of quick questions here now and see if we can get some quick answers from the panel. So the first one is to Franklin Griffiths. George Reynoldson has mentioned that Dmitry Medvedev reminded various Russian ministries that they have until February to present their leadership plan for the Arctic Council chairmanship role, which, as you mentioned, Franklin, begins in May 2021. Medvedev says he wants to highlight Russian national security. With this in mind, how might Russia prioritize its leadership plan? I'm going to ask you to answer that if you can, briefly, Frank.
It's on again. Yeah, it says I'm muted here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I think myself that very probably the statement we've heard about Russia preparing itself for the way it wants to lead the Arctic Council is for domestic consumption. It's a rather tough-minded statement that speaks about military threats and the rest. The Arctic Council is not, however, certainly not an executive institution, nor is it one that allows for discussion of security matters. These are prohibited by express decree among all those countries, the 8 who agreed to set up the council. So I don't think there's something definite going on here. It's maybe a bit of a worry. I'd say we need to see a little further what's going on and what comes out of the Russian planning process. At the same time, in my view, this is a window for Canada to speak to the Ruskies and to say, you know, look, we want a series of things to be done from a Canadian point of view, but we think we share with you a permafrost interest. Let us put this together onto the table of the Arctic Council. Now, this could come from private Canadian consultations with Russians, or it could go through the Canadian government, Environment and Climate Change Canada, for instance. So my guess is not to take this as, my answer is not to take this as a real sign of trouble yet. Oh, I'm not hearing you, Tony.
Sorry, Franklin, I'm going to read 2 questions to the group, and then I'm going to ask the first question I'm going to put to Chris, and then to the second one to Dali and Jocelyn. Again, we're going to be looking for short answers because we do have a contribution coming from Canada's Minister of Environment, the Honourable Jonathan Wilkinson. So we want to make time for that. Jay Mather has put a question or a comment. Well, it ends with a question. It is becoming ever more obvious that direct sequestration of CO2 from the atmosphere is essential for humanity to have a realistic chance of stabilizing the climate. It would therefore seem that the entire future of our species is linked to a carbon economy as we both decarbonize and capture, use carbon. Carbon needs to become a core source of our synthetic fuel production, soil enhancement, carbohydrate production, and building materials. What is the view of the panel as to how we likely will happen at that scale and speed that is relevant for our civilization to persist? When I've read the second question, I'm going to ask Chris if you could answer that as briefly, if that's possible. The second question comes from Nadine Fabi, and I'm going to summarize. She pays very high compliments to the comments by Jocelyn and Dali, and the comment especially about species among species, and how important it is to have these voices in the permafrost discussion. But her specific question is to Jocelyn if she has any ideas about effective inclusion of these voices in policies related to permafrost loss. In some sense, Dali has already answered that question, but Jocelyn, could you briefly add a comment on that before we get to the intervention from the Minister of the Environment?
Yes, thank you, Tony, and thank you, Nadine, for your question. It does come from that place of recognizing equality. Like we even have a challenge of doing it amongst ourselves as a people, and then trying to bring animals into our decisions in a meaningful and equitable way becomes deeply a deep challenge for us. And again, I think it's partly because we're making those decisions just with our heads and our hands. And so when you're thinking, with your heart and your emotions, you make different decisions. And so when we're coming at it from a place of values, obligation, stewardship, responsibility for all of those around us, it changes the priorities from our need to take and serve ourselves, rather more to the need to care for all of those around us. So one of the places where I think a lot about this question is actually in fisheries management. I do feel that fisheries management is pretty much 100% guided by science, and the science itself is folly in its ability to truly assess the health and condition of a lake and its residents. And because of that, we have unsustainable fisheries and fishing practices. So for example, one practice that I'll pick on is catch and release fishing. This is not an honorable practice to play with your food. We have stories about boys who were taken to the sea to live with the fish after he disrespected fish. This is a deep conflict to our teachings. Yet we allow it. And yet we manage the whole lakes with numbers that do not reflect reality. So I think that to truly honor fish, we need to respect fish in our policies to start with, and treat them not as objectivable numbers, but treat them as beings who live. And even so, we need to educate scientists to think bigger. And we need to educate policymakers to see limitations of science. And, and I know we put a lot of weight on science in our decisions, and I don't undermine the value and the advancements that science has brought us, but I am critical of it as a scientist in recovery, because I just see it so it's limiting, and it's bringing our decisions to only here when there's all. And so, but all can be held when we think with values, when we make decisions with heart, we honor the place of emotions in our conversations. Then I think we get deeper and we can better honor our right and wrong.
Thank you, Jocelyn. I'm going to go straight to Scott for a comment, for Chris, for a comment on the other question.
Yes, I think the question is basically asks the big question, which is, where is this whole thing going? And the fundamental point I would like to make is that we've known about the basic physics of the atmosphere for about 200 years. We know about the physics of carbon dioxide since 1859. We've known for 50 years what is likely to occur. But one of the things that we're constantly given are surprises when the Earth system begins to behave in ways that we don't know, we don't anticipate, because our ideas and our minds are not sufficiently experienced and are not big enough. So all I can say is we shall have to wait and see what happens. But in the end, nobody can say that we didn't know.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that, Martha. Do you have a brief thought to add, Dolly?
Oh, I wanted to comment on the question posed specifically to Jocelyn. I think that at the international level, and what I have seen specifically within the United Nations, is this movement toward the rights of Mother Earth, the rights of nature, the rights of the environment. And for Indigenous peoples who, again, have a profound and intimate relationship with their ecosystems and environment, it's important to ask the question, then who speaks for such living things? It becomes very subjective. You know, as much as I appreciate the support, for example, of the government of Bolivia toward Indigenous peoples at the domestic level, that's a whole nother story. But at the international level, when they began to advance some of these ideas, the question was, well, wait a second. You don't speak for the environment. You don't speak for Mother Earth. You don't speak for the whales. It becomes a very subjective question and matter. So we have to take into account the voices of Indigenous peoples who have this important reciprocal relationship with all living things. So thank you for the question.
Okay, thank you. Now, we're now going to hear from Canada's Minister of the Environment on this question, the Honourable Jonathan Wilkinson.
Good afternoon, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. I'd like to thank Massey College for having me here today to say a few words on the pressing issue of permafrost emissions. I'd also like to thank a friend and former clean technology colleague of mine, Michael Brown, for inviting me to be here with you today. Canada is concerned about the fate of permafrost in a warming climate for a number of reasons. Important among these are the likely impacts for Inuit and other northerners. We also, though, know what happens in the Arctic does not stay in the Arctic. The consequences of permafrost thaw and the potential release of greenhouse gases are a global issue. We are living right now through extraordinary times. The world is faced with simultaneous crises. The COVID-19 pandemic, of course, but also the crises of climate change and rapid biodiversity loss. While our government's top priority continues to be fighting the COVID-19 pandemic, we must also work to address other long-term threats. Canadians expect their governments to be able to deal with more than one issue at any point in time. They expect us to be able to walk and chew gum. Canadians from coast to coast to coast are already experiencing the effects of a warming climate. Extreme weather events like floods and wildfires and prolonged heat waves are becoming all too frequent. Canada, as you know, is warming at twice the global rate, 3 times in the north. And we know that climate change is driven by carbon emissions from human activities. The northern permafrost region contains almost twice the amount of carbon presently in the atmosphere. As you know very well, as the climate warms, permafrost thaws and potentially releases some of this immense carbon pool into the atmosphere. Permafrost warming and thawing is already happening. There is a high degree of confidence that circumpolar permafrost temperatures have reached record high levels in recent years. Climate models are projecting widespread permafrost thaw during this century and beyond, with continued warming. But the amount of thaw depends on our ability to rein in our emissions. And that is why our government is committed to exceeding our current 2030 Paris Agreement target and to achieving net zero emissions by 2050. Our climate plan is a good start, and it's on track to deliver more emissions reductions than any other plan in Canadian history. It included more than 50 measures, including phasing out coal, major investments in public transit and electric vehicles, and pricing pollution. But we also know we need to go further, which is why we will be introducing an enhanced plan in the coming months, and we will be legislating 5-year emissions targets. Nature-based solutions are an important part of Canada's approach. They can provide up to 1/3 of total carbon dioxide mitigation required by 2030 to keep global warming below 2 degrees Celsius. They also make communities more resilient to the impacts of climate change, enhance biodiversity, and improve human health and well-being. As stewards of the world's second largest landmass, a fifth of the world's fresh water, and the longest coastline in the world, we understand the leadership role Canada must play internationally. That is why Canada is leading the Nature-Based Solutions Action Track along with Mexico, and why we're working with our partners in the Ocean Risk and Resilience Action Alliance to leverage private investment in nature-based solutions. Canada has one of the world's largest storehouses of carbon in nature. We need to do more to protect carbon in place in a way that also helps biodiversity both in Canada and abroad. The most vital requirement of all is engagement, which is why the conversation we're having today is so important. We need scientists and policy analysts to share their knowledge and ideas to help guide our path forward on climate change. The challenges before us are indeed significant, but it is through dialogue such as this that we can develop solutions on which we can act. I very much look forward to hearing of the results of your conversation. We certainly share a common view that we must collectively work extremely hard and extremely creatively to combat the crisis that is climate change. Thank you very much. I look forward to hearing the results of your discussions.
So, I would thank the Minister on behalf of the Massey College viewers today. I also want to thank Tom Axworthy for being a wonderful host on this occasion. I want to thank the people who sent in questions and comments. If there were some we didn't have time to get to, I apologize. But most of all, I want to thank our excellent panel, Dali, Sambo, Doro, coming to us from Anchorage, Alaska. I want to thank Jocelyn, Joe Strack, coming to us from Whitehorse in the Yukon Territory, and Chris Byrne coming from Ottawa, and Franklin Griffiths from the center of the universe in Toronto. Thank you all. You've been wonderful panelists, and we've had a very good conversation. But it is, I hope, just the start of a continuing conversation that goes on all around particularly the circumpolar Arctic, but the 8 Arctic states, but also, as a number of you said, a conversation that gets carried on at the United Nations and in global forums too. Thank you very much.